Okay, colleagues, welcome to this meeting of the Policy and Resources Executive Subcommittee, and a particular welcome to David and Stephanie from the press who are joining us today. So all the items are in public business, so the press will not need to leave us at any point today. Just a reminder to everybody that keep your microphone on mute when you're not speaking, and if you wish to speak, indicate through the chat function. So first item of business is apologies, substitutions and declaration of interest. So obviously we have this standing apology from Councillor Wilson, with Councillor Brooks substituting, and all other members are here. So are there any declarations of interest? No?
No.
Okay, thanks for that. Item 2 is the scrutiny report on COVID-19. I would intend to go through it in the same way as we went through previously, with the Chief Executive introducing the report, and then we go through section by section. We obviously had an addendum report issued last night, and I'll propose that Scott can speak to that when we get to paragraph 514 in the report. So, okay, can I invite Aubrey to speak to the report?
Okay, Convener, thank you very much. As the normal run of the activity, we have brought before you a report identifying actions in the log which officers have been involved in, and also in the body of the report, the current issues, a variety of different items identified against the HSCP, Education, Communities and Environment, Regeneration and Resources. Each of the directors, if there's any questions, will pick up, or the heads of service will pick up any specifics on that. One additional area which we have identified is the meeting which I have had with the Cabinet Secretary, together with Louise Long, in terms of the letter which was forwarded or sent to her probably way back in May time, and an update of the meeting is there. Convener, over and above that, refer members to the recommendations and take any questions.
Better unmute myself. Okay, thanks, Aubrey. So let's go through the report section by section. So the first section I'll take is the HSCP section, which is running from paragraph 5.5 to 5.9. Does anybody have any questions on that? I don't see any indicated in the chat. No? Okay, we'll then go on to section, the Education and Community section, which is paragraphs 510 and 511. I've got an indication from Councillor McElhenney and Councillor Alfield that they want to ask questions on 510, and Councillor Brooks and Councillor Robertson on 511. So, Councillor McElhenney, Chris first on 510.
Yeah, thanks. On item 5.10, 2 points. First point would be, is there any update on some of the national direction that's been given regarding newly qualified NQTs, newly qualified teachers? So obviously we've got newly qualified teachers in Inverclyde that have, some cases, been waiting 4 years to find a permanent place. But there's been, I suppose, Mr. Swinney's made a statement that they'll play a pivotal role in the schools recovery plan, but the NQTs, well, most of them actually are now effectively unemployed again. So I was wondering if there could be any update on that. The other issue would be, you remember about a month ago, there was a slight, maybe jovial debate on who had the legal responsibilities over the decisions to close schools or reopen schools, taking into account the health and safety. I've obviously thought that the Education Act was clear that we as a local authority had that locus, and I think at the time yourself, Stephen, to get Jerry Mohan to confirm that that wasn't the case. It was the Scottish Government's guidance, but I did notice that in Friday's leaders meeting at COSLA, you've sought further legal advice on that position. So is there any update then if Mr. Mohan thinks his position is going to change on that? Is there going to be a situation that it will actually be up to us as a local authority to determine when it's safe for schools to go back? And if we determine that we don't think it is safe, then we would be in a position to perhaps not have schools go back on the 11th of August in line with what our national direction is.
Okay, Ruth can come in if she feels the need to come in terms of newly qualified teachers. The position, as I understand it, at a national level, and I am directly involved, is that the government has indicated that they wish all newly qualified teachers from the 2019-20 cohort to be offered a temporary one-year contract, and the cost of that would be funded from the £100 million that the government had announced, or the Deputy First Minister had announced in Parliament last Tuesday. Discussions are ongoing between COSLA and the government around how exactly that would work in practice. Because there are some authorities, for example, have actually given all the newly qualified teachers a post, and others haven't. So that detail is still being worked through in principle. But to be clear, that relates only to the 19-20 cohort. It doesn't relate to any newly qualified teachers from previous years, or indeed any newly qualified teachers who will come through the system next year. There clearly is an issue with national workforce planning, where there are more teachers coming out of college or university or qualifying than there are posts in the system. Any newly qualified teacher who secures a post through that route, their position is supposed to be, in a sense, supernumerary, there to support the return to schools, help with the catch-up, potentially cover any posts that might become vacant due to people being off shielding, etc. There is an aspiration on the part of the teaching unions for teachers who are potentially currently on the supply list to receive posts as well. But there hasn't been any national agreement around that at this point in time. Ruth, do you want to come in and clarify the position locally?
So the position locally is we're waiting further guidance. We have a list of all the qualified teachers who've left in June 2020, those who have secured posts, those both within our authority and out with our authority, and we're anxious to be as clear with our communications as possible, but we're just waiting for the guidance. I know there's an education recovery group meeting tomorrow, and maybe something will come out of there.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that. In terms of the sort of legal responsibilities, you're right. COSLA leaders have asked COSLA officers to seek legal advice around relative responsibilities. Who's responsible for, in a sense, agreeing to reopen schools? Who would be responsible for legally for closing schools? That advice hasn't yet been provided to COSLA leaders, so I can't advise you on that. But Gerard, I don't know if you've got a view that you maybe want to share with the committee.
Well, we would obviously take as a local authority into account any aspect of legal advice or further legal advice that comes from COSLA or any other source. Our position quite clearly with schools and with all other issues is to follow the national guidance, the Scottish Government guidance, because that's in the best interests of the public, pupils and the authority. Obviously, we retain liabilities for occupiers' liabilities, statutory responsibilities and the like. That's not defrayed by anything. But I would accept and I would listen to any legal advice that comes to the contrary. But our position has been to follow the national advice as issued by the Scottish Government.
But just to clarify, Ger, we also retain our employers' responsibilities and liabilities as well.
Absolutely. As I'm saying, any type of occupier's liability or any form of statutory duties or liabilities in terms of opening up any premises, schools or other premises, yes. Okay.
Chris, are you satisfied with the responses? Do you want to come back? You okay? Right, moving on. Ronnie, you want to come in at 5:10?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thank you. It's just a quick question on school layouts. What I wondered was how far down the road we were, or we are, basically, in changing the school layouts to take cognizance of the socially isolating model. and now, given that it looks potentially like we're going to be back to full education in August, you know, is it the intention really to leave things or to move things back? You know, is there a cost involved in terms of putting everything back to cater for all of the children coming back in August, if that in fact is the question?
Okay, Ruth.
Okay, so we had, some schools had moved tables and chairs into gym halls, and the relatively easy things to move had already been moved. We'd urged schools against moving any of the heavier equipment like the cupboards and things, and we certainly hadn't sought as yet storage. We'd said to hold fire because this was an ever-changing circumstance. So none of the big items that we would have had to move have yet been moved. Now, of course, things could go either way prior to August. But we fully anticipate that we will be able to move fairly quickly to 100% moving, and if we end sort of 100% return, if we have a 50% return, then we will have some bigger items to move, and we'll do that in the week before schools go back.
Okay, you okay with that, Ronnie?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Maybe just a very quick supplementary, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I just wondered if we had any update on the trade union position with regard to the August opening. I know I think I touched on this one before, but I just wondered if we had any updates on that.
Well, again, at a national level, the trade unions are engaged in discussions, both through the Education Recovery Group, which I co-chair, and through various structures within COSLA. So those sort of discussions are ongoing, and obviously the aim is to try and get the trade unions to buy into any national agreement that is reached, support any national guidance. But that will be part of discussions that will be going on over the next few weeks. I don't know, Ruth, at a local level where discussions are.
At a local level, we've had meetings every week with the trade unions. They've fully been involved in all the risk assessments and our planning. What I would say is that we had a very positive meeting just after the announcement, and that we will continue to work with them and meet regularly with them to alleviate any concerns. But locally, the communication has been very positive.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Thank you.
Graham, your next 5.11, I think you want to come in on?
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, 5.11, and it's also the recommendation 3.3. The paper talks about accepting the most economically advantaged tender, and I just want to make sure that there's also more weight than just the economics. I want the best, within reason, organisation to deliver this process. Also, is there any weight put to a local company or a local charity that can deliver this counselling service? Just the delegated power that 3.3 is asking specifically says to accept the most economically advantaged. I would hope that it's not just that, and can I get clarity that the weighting is more than just pounds, shillings, pence?
Okay, Ruth, you want to come in initially on that?
Through you, Convener, we took a paper to committee some time ago to ask for quality and quantity, the 60/40. My understanding is that's in place for this. I would suspect the local scenario would be the same as any of our procurement offers. I don't know if Gerard wants to come in with anything like that, but certainly I'm not aware of anything for local companies, but certainly around the quality, there was consideration given to that in the tender.
Convener, I don't know anything about the actual tenderers themselves, but the officers group will make a recommendation exactly as Ruth has outlined there in terms of the agreed contract procurement criteria, which will involve an element for quality and an element in terms of price. And that recommendation will be evaluated, and then there'll be a formal report to myself, which I will share with other relevant officers before any delegated powers, if they are granted, are exercised. I don't know if there's a local company within that mix at all, Convener, though.
Okay, Elizabeth, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. It was really just to kind of just say thank you for getting us to the point, or to everyone who's been involved for getting us to the point where we have such a healthy bank of people who have tendered for this piece of work. I'm on record already as saying how important I think it is, and how I'd hoped we would have been able to get it a lot sooner than we have, but actually having it in place when the kids go back in August is going to be amazing, and actually probably more crucial than ever before. And I just wanted to kind of pay tribute to everybody's work and getting us this far. And also having such a healthy bank of tenders to consider.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Right, I don't see any other questions on education community, so we'll move on to environment, regeneration and resources. So paragraphs 512 through to 524. So I'm just looking at the questions I've been given in advance, so I don't see anything in 512 or 513. So the first question is from Chris in 514. But before I bring Chris in, I'll bring Scott in to speak to the addendum report, or Gail, whoever's going to speak to it. Scott?
Thank you, Convener. I'll not cover the report in any detail. It's a fairly short report. What I would like to cover just very briefly is that since the report was written, there was revised guidance issued by the Scottish Government yesterday around early afternoon, titled Safer Public Spaces for Scotland. And this guidance sets a context to keep people safe in the easing of lockdown, particularly retail easing in town centres. And there's no surprises, I guess, to officers here because it was anticipated, but it talks about maintaining the 2 metre physical distancing as a key objective. It seeks for us to respect the needs of the vulnerable and disabled people who may not have been out and about due to shielding, and it recognises the challenges of high footfalls in town centres. And it recommends the kinds of measures that we saw on our footways and roads yesterday, which included parking being removed in some locations, footways being widened, and so on. And it supports the cafe culture of putting cafes onto public roads. I'll not say any more, but I'm happy to answer any questions on it.
Okay, Chris, you want to come in?
Yep, thanks, Convener. I think the first point to make is I'm well aware that the officers are themselves well aware of the serious concerns that have been expressed by members of the public and the business community. Because I know, without telling any stories out of school, I know Mr. Allen, for example, was up on the phone last night still discussing concerns with members well after 11 o'clock at night. Certainly that's when I was on the phone to him. So I appreciate that officers are taking ownership for the situation we're in. I was very comfortable to accept a scheme that basically was established on 2 principles. The first being safety, to make sure that any reopening of shops and people basically coming back out in large numbers didn't have an adverse effect on the spread of the coronavirus. And the second principle being supporting business, because I think we all agree, that all parties, no parties, that's a priority for us. But from those 2 points, I think, comes the 2 key issues of consultation and proportionality. So I think there are genuine concerns and there are valid criticisms that there wasn't an adequate consultation with the business community regarding, does the proposals meet their demands, or indeed would the proposals and implementation of what we see on our streets, will that actually have an adverse impact on the business community? And to the second issue of proportionality, did the mass closure or stopping of people parking on basically the main shopping streets from Gourock all the way up to Kilmacombe through Greenock and Port Glasgow, was that proportionate to the demand that we were going to see on the streets with the extra footfall with shops opening? With the elephant in the room, of course, that on these streets, shops such as Sainsbury's and Gourock, or Farm Foods, or butchers, etc., these shops have all been opened for the last 3 months, and people have been shopping in these shops without any new or additional physical distancing measures. And I think we should first of all say thank you and well done to people in Inverclyde, because they have shown a very good degree of common sense and a safety first approach when they've been going shopping. And I can absolutely accept and understand the unfairness that small retailers feel when they've seen what's happened outside their shops, but then they look to large supermarkets who have massive car parks with no physical distancing in place, where people can just park in the car park and walk out of your car next to other people. So I think it's valid for them to say that what's actually happened has not achieved what the policy was supposed to achieve. And I was very much in favour of a policy that would, one, make it easier for businesses to open, two, make it safer for businesses to open, and three, as we had agreed at the last committee by delegating authority to the corporate director, was that where there were areas of the public realm that we could allow businesses to expand into safely and people could still continue to walk about other shops, we should encourage that. And I think that if we strip it all back, what I was really looking for is just a system that we could have temporary and localised closures of a few parking bays to assist that outside restaurants and cafes. We didn't need a mass closure or the prohibition of parking outside every single shop, because the reality meant that we turned many of our towns and all of our towns and villages effectively into ghost towns yesterday. But I will say that I accept that officers were very quick to react to that, and I think that there is sometimes you got to just mea culpa and say this was a mess. We took, and we're all aware of what's happened in Inverclyde over the last 3 months, being the highest death rate in Scotland. I think we took a very safety first approach, and it's clear it was not proportionate to the demand that was going to be there on the streets. So obviously I was informed last night that we had started to scale back, and from a Europe perspective, I'd already started to hear good feedback on the back of myself, Councillor Alfeld, Councillor Quinn, and everyone being contacted all day, raising those concerns with officers. I started to hear good feedback, and then I was told that today in Westbrook Hall Street, moving into other councillors' wards in Greenock, we would start to see cones moving back. But this is perhaps a chain of questions that I now have. Is the feedback I'm getting today is that the situation in Greenock is actually worse than it was yesterday. So I would be looking for some clarity from officers how yesterday, when there was an overwhelming, probably absolutely correct criticism of the council for the policy implementation, how are people reporting back today that the situation is worse? I was under the impression that the cones would be getting removed from Greenock. I've not had an update on the Port Glasgow situation, but perhaps Scott could address that as well. And I think I've made my points clear here that this was a mess and we need to fix it. But the one actual point, just to get absolute clarity on, one of the concerns I had from multiple complaints yesterday was that there was a reduction in disabled parking bays. I had been led to believe that regardless of any measures we put in place, we wouldn't be losing any disabled parking bays. So as well as making sure we get this fixed so that businesses can basically have the consultation they should have had now, and we can address their concerns, can we also make sure that perhaps when we're trying to implement policies, and I accept, Mr. Allen, that we did think it would be, you correct me, was it roughly the 14th or the 16th of July that this was going to happen, and the government did bring that forward, so I accept we had to move quickly. But in the absence of being able to undertake a full equality impact assessment, could we make sure that there is some sort of dynamic one carried out now, so that policies that we are putting in place, whether it's putting up cones to block parking, moving cones away again, can we make sure we actually have some sort of equality impact assessment to make sure that doesn't have a negative impact on disabled members of the community and their ability to access shops?
Okay, Graham's want to come in, and I'll bring Graham in for a second, and then I'll bring Scott in. But to be perfectly fair, Chris, the parking measures that were put in didn't turn our towns and villages into ghost towns yesterday. The rain turned them into ghost towns. I was in Kilmacombe yesterday, and there was plenty of parking spaces both on street and the car park, including plenty of disabled parking bays as well. Basically, people weren't going out shopping yesterday because of the weather, and it's not much better today either, to be perfectly honest. But Graham, I'll let you come in first, and then I'll bring Scott in.
Yeah, thanks very much, convener. Like Chris, obviously the inbox has been very full, and I think convener can confirm that I was on emails at midnight last night trying to ask some questions and get some stuff sorted.
Yeah, I was sleeping at the time.
That's fine. One of the challenges I had from constituents was it wasn't the rain, convener, that kept them away. They knew there was no parking, so they chose not to go into Greenock Town Centre. They went to Port Glasgow instead, to the retail park. So they had plenty of parking spaces because people had chosen not to shop in Greenock Town Centre. I think what's been said has been helpful. I think officers are very much aware. I think most members have been communicating with them, even from distance of Australia, to ensure officers are aware of constituents' challenges and problems. I was of the opinion that we could implement, what we were going to implement was, should cafes require pavement space, then we would obviously take away some parking in that area to allow the pedestrian footpath to move onto the carriageway. I think the presentation we had, the members' briefing, it was lovely, sort of plant pots that were put on the side of the road, and I had envisaged that is actually what we were going to do. It wasn't a blanket no parking in our test centres across Inverclyde. And for that reason, I would hope that officers would swap the priority that we currently have in place. Yes, we have a legal TRO or TTRO, Scotland falls under section 14.1 of the Road Traffic Act, and that's fine. That is in place, I believe, till late August. But if we remove the cones, and then when we have dynamic intelligence, which we have on the ground, many constituents will speak to us, where there is problems, where cafes wish to put pavement seating, where also that's legal due to the Licensing Act, etc., if they sell alcohol. If we can facilitate that, then at that stage, we will implement the cones, or we'll put up something to make sure that people don't park. I think we've got it the wrong way around. I think we implement no parking where we need to, as opposed to take away the no parking where we actually don't need it. So that's hopefully that we could have at the end of this discussion. I'm happy to make that a formal proposal should it go to that.
So let's get on mute myself. Elizabeth, you were wanting to come in?
Yeah, I completely get that we could have done what we've done and people could have been very happy with it. But I suppose the fact is that we're all seeing as elected members that people aren't happy with what we've done. So I think it's beholden on us to kind of bring that back to this table and see what can be done in that dynamic way that we're talking about, to kind of change things as the people round about us suggest that they should be changed. The bit I'm a bit disappointed in, I suppose, is the engagement side of it. You know, we had the briefing where we talked about the consultation that was going to be live and how people were being encouraged to bring forward their ideas as to how we could do things safer and put measures in place and spend the money that was becoming available for those types of things. And I'm not sure that I'm seeing evidence of that being the result here. I'm not sure that I'm seeing this all happening as a result of what's come out of that consultation period, because I know what people have told me that they've put into their responses, and it wasn't what we've done. So that engagement side of things, which I think we have the capacity to do very well, but we need to do it dynamically. We need to do it in a kind of agile way for situations like this, and I'm not sure that we have in this instance. But we've still got opportunity to keep on doing it now, and I think we should.
I mean, I think Jim's indicated he wants to come and bring him in a second, but I think there is a danger we're conflating different processes here as well. But I'm sure the officers can clarify that when they get a chance to comment. Jim, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I suppose my comment really is that the idea behind the officers' proposals was actually quite clear, obviously, to make our town centre safe and safe for pedestrians to walk, and to make sure they maintained the social distancing. Now, my understanding was we weren't banning traffic. What we were trying to do is remove traffic from, for instance, West Blackhall Street and put it on to Dalrymple Street. Now, the idea throughout this, for over the last 3 months, people who are able have been quite happy to walk a mile, half a mile, cycle, walk, and doing that. Now, my understanding is that what we were trying to do is get that whole idea of that town centre feel that pedestrians felt safe to walk and therefore to come back to be in. With that, also mitigate it by saying to people, if you want to park, you can park at Liverpool Street. I know, for instance, I certainly raised the chance of opening up the Jamaica Street car park earlier if that was possible. But I think fundamentally, we've got to actually look at it and say, well, what was the idea behind this? And the idea behind this certainly wasn't to stifle business, but rather make sure that pedestrians and citizens in general felt safe to come into our town centre. Now, I'm listening to the comments, and me and Graham always have the argument about car and town centres, and we'll continue to have that. And we know town centres are going to change, and we know our lives are going to change, maybe through COVID-19. But I think we've got to be very, very careful that we say on one hand, we want to try and promote the cafe culture, but on the other hand, we still want to promote cars virtually being parked outside the shop that they want to go into. And I think it's trying to change that culture. So that's my comment for what it's worth.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I don't see any other comments, so bring Scott back in, and if he wants to bring any officer in, feel free.
Thank you, Convener. I'll do my best to answer quite a lot of questions there, and then I'll bring Gail in on the back of it. I guess starting with Councillor McElhenney's questions and the engagement with the business community. Would we have wanted to engage more with the business community? Then absolutely. This is a kind of measure that normally you would consult with over several months before bringing in measures as significant as this. So yes, we would definitely want to consult to a greater extent with the business community. I think one of the challenges we've faced, though, is that the members' briefing was on the 18th of June, and then in the afternoon, the First Minister announced that the non-essential shops would open on the 29th of June, and it gave us 6 working days. And I think that has been a big challenge for officers to do something meaningful in that timescale. The timescale indicated in the members' briefing, we were working towards 16th of July. So in a normal world, we would have brought a report back to this committee to say what we're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks towards an opening in mid-July. So that I think has been a significant challenge for officers, and I can sympathise with traders who didn't understand what this was all about on Monday, and that situation may have changed a little bit by now. In terms of proportionality, it's a hard call, because if you get a sunny day, the streets are much busier than what we got on Monday. The key elements of the guidance is that we provide for 2-metre social distancing to protect people. These are people who are maybe out and about just now, but also people who've not been out and about and who are vulnerable and possibly disabled. And they have to have the ability to walk 2 metres apart from other people who are maybe coming another direction, standing outside shops. So the approach we took was to put in measures on Monday, which were significant on the basis we could pull them back if they're not necessary. And if I refer to paragraph 2.6 in my report, where it says officers seek to ensure that there is no detriment to trading, and restrictions will only be applied if absolutely necessary to facilitate social distancing. But it took the experience of Monday for us to see how the streets were working. At the end of the day, all we put out was cones, and cones are easy lifted. And a lot of these cones disappeared last night, and Gail can maybe give us more information. So in terms of proportionate, we're different today compared to what we were yesterday. I'm sure we'll be different on Wednesday compared to today. What some of the traders are telling us, and we're trying to speak to every trader in all the town centres and Kilmacombe, some of the traders are saying that they chose not to open on Monday because the forecast was bad, and they also wanted to see how things are going. Another message they've given us is that a big issue for them is the street trading, which doesn't kick in until the 6th of July. So traders are saying they desperately want to see the street cafes because that brings footfall to the town centres, and they see that as an important thing. Councillor McLean, I think you raised an issue about Greenock being no different from yesterday, so I'm going to give that to Gail at the end of what I'm going to say, because there have been changes, but Gail's got some detail on that. And Gail can also talk about the disabled parking bays. I think in a kind of wider sense, the key issue in all this is that as officers working on Monday with a direction from Scottish Government, we're working without guidance, but what we did is actually fully consistent with the guidance that was published yesterday afternoon. And the guidance in many ways would actually require us to go further than we went on Monday. The dilemma for us moving forward will be for officers to be proactive to the situation so that we will seek to have the minimum measures on the street to make sure that we have got the social distancing. We want to encourage the cafe cultures and we'll facilitate that so far as we possibly can. And we want to be compliant with guidelines. And we'll retain the dialogue that we started on Monday with all of the traders in the streets. And of course, with yourselves as elected members representing our customers. Gail, do you want to say something about the extent that we pulled back the measures?
Yes, thank you, councillors. Thank you, Scott. Yes, we had officers on site in all town centres on Monday, just having a look at what the pedestrian behaviour was, where there were pinch points, and also to determine what shops actually opened, because we were not aware exactly of what shops would consider reopening on the Monday. We were just aware that they were permitted to reopen on Monday. In Port Glasgow, we have reduced parking reduction in Princess Street. We looked at where people were walking and where the requirement was to retain that element of social distancing measures. In Gourock, we have removed Shore Street and we have removed the cones on the double yellow side of Kempock Street. In Greenock, we have reduced the cones between Grey Place and Jamaica Street, and that is again to reflect the pedestrian movement that officers saw. And in Kilmacombe, we have retained solely the parking restriction in front of St James's Terrace. As we move forward, we'll continue to have officers on site monitoring the situation, seeing how pedestrians react and move about people, perhaps if there is a queue or if there is other businesses reopening. The disabled parking and the loading bays will be retained throughout. Crossing points are retained, drop crossings are retained. All of the points that make it important for people to be able to move about the area safely and securely have been retained. If any comments are received from businesses in relation to anything like that, we've adapted the scheme quickly and removed cones to ensure that they are able to load and unload, or come to a solution that requires maybe a cone to be moved and then replaced. In relation to how the two consultations, I just wanted to make the point that what we're doing at the moment is not the schemes that we have consulted on and that we did our members briefing on. This is an early temporary response to social distancing measures, and the consultation is still ongoing, and all that feedback will be considered by officers. So that piece of work is still ongoing.
Okay, and mindful that we've given this a good airing and we've still got a lot of business to go, we'll probably be discussing this for the best part of maybe come up for half an hour, certainly 20-25 minutes. Is there any member that wants to come back in? Chris, are you indicating you want to come back in? Dan Graham?
Yes.
Chris?
Yeah, it just, I mean, officers should be aware of it. Just obviously have dropped curbs, so it's crucial to retain them for wheelchair users. But blue badge holders in Inverclyde don't just use disabled parking bays. So you think of Kemphook Street as one example. The entire south side of Kemphook Street, which is a solid yellow line, disabled blue badge holders can use that side of the street, and for mobility reasons it's quite often easier for them. If you think of Westbrook Hall Street, you've got the stretch that runs up by the Ladbrokes, etc., where Morgan's used to be. It's called Phoenix now. All of these bits of a street that are single yellow lines down the side of Smith's, single yellow lines. A blue badge holder can park there just the way they can park in Cathcart Square. So although we're saying, yeah, we're not actually reducing the parking available for disabled blue badge holders, we are, because many blue badge holders don't actually specifically use the disabled parking bays. So that's why my point, I think, has to be taken on board, that when we're putting measures in place, we will be reducing the availability for blue badge holders to park in our town centres, because I mean, Westbrook Hall Street's got, how many designated disabled bays has it actually got? It's not a big number. Somewhere in the region of 3, 4, maybe 5 tops. So there's a lot more blue badge holders shop in our town centre than that. And historically, once things get back to normal, if you go a walk along the streets, you'll see where we've got solid yellow lines and even double yellow lines, which don't have the marks on the curbstones. Blue badge holders can use them too, and they do use them. So I just think that we need to make sure we dynamically assess the impact that we're having on disabled people and their ability to, and I know that Councillor Clotterty does make a point I agree with, that people who are able to maybe park a wee bit further away and walk, that's good, but a lot of people aren't able to do that. They need to try and park as close as possible to a shop. That's why supermarkets have an overabundance of disabled parking bays at the front of them, but we don't obviously have a disabled parking bay outside every shop on our high street. That someone who has a blue badge holder, they may not be able to park at one shop and then walk 200 yards up and down the shops. So I think that's just got to be taken on board, and any positive impacts that you can hopefully make to ensure that blue badge holders can keep the access they've already got. Because technically speaking, somebody with a blue badge could just park on Westbrook Hall Street next to the cones and block the whole road there, because I don't think it's no stopping at any time, is it? We could just put a blue badge on that. So we don't want to go down that route. So we want to try and make it as user friendly for blue badge holders, and indeed businesses and everyone else alike. So just hopefully that comment can be taken on board.
Okay, thanks for that, Graham. You're wanting to come back in.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yeah, to ensure that officers can actually implement 2.6 of Scott's additional paper, I think we have to make a decision here as elected members, and the decision surely is that parking restrictions are withdrawn, and then 2.6 comes into play. And 2.6 was then saying, so if officers determine that to ensure social distancing or to ensure a cafe culture on the 6th of July, or whatever the officers determine is required, at that stage, that piece of the road is then closed off. So that's a proposal.
Well, okay, thanks for that. But just to clarify, Graham, we're in the middle of a report, right? And we'll come to the recommendations once we've worked our way through the report.
Just so that Jenny got it.
Yeah, and there is a recommendation in the addendum report 3.1, which will become 3.9 of the main report. Okay, so well, if anybody wants to move anything contrary to the recommendations, we'll consider that when we come to the recommendations. Okay, just in terms of Scott, I'll give you the opportunity to come back in and any of those further points, but then we need to move on.
Thank you, Convener. Just to support what Councillor McElhinney said about parking in yellow lines, we absolutely get that it's a facility for disabled parking, and we recognise that. And yesterday we took out the restrictions in Gourock along the whole south side of Kemphook Street. So yeah, we do get that. Thank you.
Okay, right, moving on. I've got an indication from Chris who wants to come in 5:21, and then Graham wants to come in 5:23. So Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. The paper doesn't mention which officer it was which engaged with the Scottish Government's officer, but what the paper does say is that the committee was right in the concerns that it raised. There are people in Inverclyde that are falling between the cracks. So for people who are having to go into universal credit because of simple changes to the rules aren't being made that would allow them to get whatever it is, whether it's the £2,000 grant or the furlough scheme for self-employed people. So I suppose it's disappointing that at an officer level, our officers have tried to engage with the officers at a government level in the hope that they would, well, you would assume when they conceded there are gaps, that people are falling into cracks, you'd have hoped they would have said, okay, we'll take that on, but they've not done that, so that's a bit disappointing. So I was hoping the committee then would be willing to then elevate this to a political level now that our officers have done the groundwork, established that there are gaps and cracks that people in Inverclyde are falling into here, and perhaps whether it's yourself as the committee convener or the leader of the council now, I think this should be raised as a political point, that we have cracks that people in Inverclyde are falling into. The Scottish Government officers have conceded that principle, so we think a policy decision should be made so that these cracks get filled in, so that the people in Inverclyde that I think are entitled to this money, the £2,000 grant, specifically, should get that money. So that would be up to the committee if they were happy to proceed in that. But I'm sure officers could guide us in basically the conversation they've had that have established that there are people falling into the cracks. Okay,
I'll bring officers in a second, but I do know that this particular issue has been also raised at a national level, at a political level as well. So, but I don't know, Scott or Alan, in terms of this particular matter.
Convener, I'm going to suggest that Alan speaks to this.
Yep, Alan.
Sorry, I would have to defer to Stuart, who I see is patiently waiting. He was the officer who spoke to the Scottish Government.
Okay, Stuart. You're on mute, Stuart. You're still on mute.
I should be on voice. Sorry, I'm happy to do two. Convener, it was me who spoke to William Gray, who's the senior officer responsible for the newly self-employed hardship fund. In terms of the comments that have been raised, Councillor McElhenney is absolutely correct. There was no willingness on their part to reconsider their position. Indeed, they actually advised us that the newly self-employed hardship fund could be closing relatively soon. In Inverclyde, we've supported 70 people, or we've had 70 applications for the newly self-employed hardship fund, and there have been 5 members of the community who have been ineligible for the fund as a result of receiving universal credit.
Okay. I mean, I'm more than happy if the committee wants us to agree that officers draft a letter and I'll put my name to it, to the government. Are we okay with that? You can obviously pick that up in the recommendations. Okay, moving on to 523, Graham.
Yeah, the recommendation.
That's not the time, Graham, that's the paragraph number.
Okay, thank you. The recommendations at 3.7 is that we don't meet again and we go into the cycle on the 11th of August. I just think that's an awful long space of time for no councillors to be offering scrutiny to officers during the emergency we're in, or the end of the health emergency, hopefully the end, but obviously the economic emergency that we're moving into. So I'm not too sure at what stage, Convener, that you're looking for suggestions, because do you wish to wait to the end to actually make a suggestion of what we should be doing at 3.7?
Well, we obviously have recommendations in the report, which we're going to come to in due course. I don't think that point is specific. Yeah, well, it is in 3.7.
3.7.
So basically, if members are not content with that recommendation, they can obviously move an amendment to it. So basically, the recommendation as it stands is that the standing 2 weekly meetings of this committee would cease. But basically, if there's a need for the committee to reconvene, so that, say, officers felt there was a need for the committee to meet, I felt there was a need for the committee to meet, or indeed I received representation from members that they felt there was a need for the committee to meet, then the committee would meet. There is also the delegated powers route, whereby the convener, vice convener and the leader of the minority groups could approve an emergency powers proposal. So that's the recommendation as it stands. If you've got something alternative to that, we can consider obviously when we come to the recommendations.
Okay, it was just at this stage, sorry, I'm on mute, just at this stage to allow the debate to ensure that the 6 members are happy, because as I said, I would rather we came together before that, but I'll obviously wait to the recommendations to make the proposal. But it was to give a debate that we should come together at least once during that window to have a scrutiny report and to understand what's going on. And I do appreciate that convener and yourself can call a meeting, but that's obviously maybe an extreme situation. It wouldn't actually be called simply for scrutiny.
No, that's right. And I'm happy to listen to any other views at this point in time on that particular paragraph. I've not got any indication from anybody else who want to speak on it. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just embracing the new technological age of conversing with my fellow group member when we can't sit and do it with each other at a meeting. I think Councillor Robertson will have a view on this. I think I kind of see both points. I see Graham's point in that it makes sense to have a diarised meeting. I can see your point in that, well, if there is a need for a meeting, there should be a meeting. But I think Councillor Robertson's got a good point that, well, that then means, well, what is more my point on the back of her point, from a scrutiny point of view, then that would mean that we would be relying on officers to tell us what we think we would want to scrutinise, because they would perhaps only bring a suggestion that we need a meeting if there were decisions to be made. But I think that this 2-weekly meeting, there have been lots of debates and lots of alternative recommendations over the last 2 months, which weren't recommendations for decisions to be made, such as school transport being one example. That was an action that was proposed to be taken by officers, and it would have been taken if it wasn't at a scrutiny committee that we had asked for more information and ultimately then to make a political choice on that. So I think Councillor Robertson has a view to express on that. I'd be interested to see what Councillor Alfeld's view on behalf of the independent group on that is also.
Okay. Councillor Alfeld obviously can indicate in the usual way if he wants to contribute. Chris, I don't think you need to ask him to come in. We'll bring Elizabeth in a second, but I think we just need to remember that actually the normal standing convention is the council doesn't have any meetings in July and into the early part of August. So it's not a departure from the norm, right? I accept we are in exceptional circumstances, and if members feel that those exceptional circumstances merit either this committee continuing to meet on a fortnightly basis, or as Graham's suggesting, having one meeting during the period between now and the 11th of July, and then I'm happy to listen to those arguments. I also would remind you that we've come through the most intense period probably in any of our working lives, and officers have been working incredibly hard in the last 3 months, incredibly hard, and we are getting to a period where people deserve a break, to be perfectly honest. Politicians deserve a break as well as officers. We've had people saying the other day that there was a fairly deflated response from leaderships in schools and teachers in general when they heard that all the work they had put in over the last number of weeks preparing for the blended learning model may, to some extent, not be necessary, and that the education system, teachers and other staff were exhausted. Well, I would contend that our officers must be exhausted after 3 months of such intensity. So I would just ask members to bear that in mind when you're deliberating around the issue of how many meetings you want over the summer period. Okay, but Elizabeth, bring you in.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I do tend to agree with Graham's point about having a meeting, that if there is nothing to discuss and if things have truly died down and there's really nothing that we need to kind of cover, then it can be suspended or not carried forward. But I think having it diarised and having it there, because as you say, we are in exceptional times. We don't know what the next few weeks are going to hold. And I think us having these meetings on a fortnightly basis up to now has been a protection for everyone. It's been a protection for the public of Inverclyde. It's been a protection for our officers and the decision making that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's helped us maintain that role that we absolutely have to have as councillors of scrutinising what's happening in the organisation on behalf of the public. And I think having one meeting over the course of the recess, just to kind of keep that in everybody's agenda and making sure that we're able to do that, wouldn't be a bad thing.
Okay, thanks for that, Elizabeth. I don't see anybody else indicating that they want to come in at this point, so we can again come back to that when we come to the recommendations. Okay, I don't see any other questions on that section of the report. So we now move on to section 6 of the report, paragraphs 6.1 to 6.6. In relation to the Chief Executive's meeting with Jean Freeman. I don't see anybody want to come in. I'll maybe come in terms of that. I think it's been pretty helpful feedback from the meeting, and I think we obviously are grateful for the Cabinet Secretary spending time with the Chief Executive and discussing these particular issues. But one of the issues that I suppose I'm concerned about, and it links to the later item on the agenda, just let me get the number, which is 4, the COVID mortality report. I think there are quite a number of unanswered questions around that particular report, and I know we're going to come to it, so I'm not getting into the report in too much detail. I don't think that report is the report that I was certainly looking for. I don't think it gives me the answers to the questions that I think my community needs answers to. And I think the research that's alluded to in the report and was discussed in the conversation between the Chief Executive and the Cabinet Secretary, that Public Health Scotland are working with the University of Glasgow, I think that's the sort of research that I'm looking for. That's the report I was looking for from Public Health Scotland. Ideally, some independent input into that report. And I know a number of weeks ago, the University of Glasgow did publish a report on sort of early transmissions in terms of COVID-19. Inverclyde didn't feature in that report because it was very much a sample report. But I think we should be seeking answers to some fundamental questions. How did COVID-19 come to Inverclyde in the first place? And how was it transmitted in our community so that we did end up with an early spike and we did end up as the area worst affected in terms of number of deaths? And I don't think the report later on the agenda answers those questions. I think it's written from a different perspective. It's written from the perspective essentially of how did we compare to the rest of Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And I want to know how we compare to the rest of Scotland, and I want to know how Greater Glasgow and Clyde compare to the rest of Scotland. And I want answers to the issues around how COVID-19 came to Inverclyde and how it was transmitted around Inverclyde that we ended up in the situation we ended up in. So my view is we should take up the opportunity that the meeting with the Cabinet Secretary has presented. I think we should write to the Cabinet Secretary, whether it be the Chief Executive or at a political level, and ask that a specific piece of research work be done between Public Health Scotland and the University of Glasgow on Inverclyde, and that if required, we as a council are prepared to pay the costs of producing that report from the University of Glasgow. So, I'm happy to seek your opinions on that. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say that obviously we were obviously talking about a meeting between the Chief Executive and the Chief Executive never really alluded to any of those issues, but you've now went on to effectively just a debate on the later report, and what you're saying is sensible, but again, it kind of neuters what debate we're going to have on that report. So
I don't think it does neuter that debate, Chris.
I was just going to say, I think what you're saying is that I will likely agree with what you're saying, but could we maybe not just keep that all together for that debate, and then any recommendations we make on the back of the actual report, because we could end up with some recommendations now and maybe some similar recommendations at that report, and that report's obviously talking about the issue you're talking about.
No, well, it is, Chris, but with all due respect, the later report doesn't actually mention Public Health Scotland progressing research in collaboration with the University of Glasgow, right? And that's what's specifically spelt out in the report. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for me to raise the issue at this point in time. And obviously you couldn't raise that issue in a vacuum from the later report. Right?
Yeah, look, that's fine. I think the later report is a whitewash, and I'm disappointed that it's not been called that more, and basically for an officer level, it's been presented to us without any recommendations to take it forward. So I'm happy to support what you're proposing.
You're going on to discuss the points you might want to make under the later report, right? So I'm talking about specifically about this piece of research. Okay, I've alluded to the later report, and I may have more to say when we get to the later report, right? I don't know whether I'd use those particular words, but I might share your sentiment. But this is specifically around the fact that the Cabinet Secretary has advised Public Health Scotland is currently progressing research in collaboration with the University of Glasgow, which may be helpful to Inverclyde to understand why it was significantly impacted, and advise that the matter would be followed up, right? So what I'm saying is, I think we should specifically follow up that conversation with the Cabinet Secretary by writing to the Cabinet Secretary, asking that a particular feature of that research should be a focus on Inverclyde, and that if additional resources are required to produce a report timelessly, we're not talking about a report coming out, research coming out in 12 months' time, a timeous report, and that the situation in Inverclyde could be prioritised. We as a council would be prepared to provide funding to allow that research to take place as quickly as possible. So that's a separate issue from the later report. Okay, any other comments on that? So are we content to agree that particular proposal and incorporate that into the recommendations?
Yeah, I'll be happy with that.
Yeah, I'd be happy with that.
Yep.
Okay, I see agreement on that. Okay, I don't see any other questions on that section. So section 7, COVID testing, any questions on that? Okay, I don't see any on that. So moving on to section 8, workforce issues. Chris, you were wanting to come in section 7?
Yeah, it's just a point of clarity in that each time that the mobile unit's been located somewhere, any press releases followed up by saying that that's where it's going to be permanently located or located for the rest of its stay, but it then obviously moved to St Andrews. And when it moved to St Andrews, we were told it would be staying there for the rest of its stay in the area, but it's now obviously moved to Port Glasgow. Just curious if there was any data that actually drove that approach to move it from basically quite a tight area, if you triangulate it from Greenock Town Centre to St Andrews and then into Port Glasgow Town Centre, and will it stay in Port Glasgow Town Centre now until it is determined that it has to leave the area?
Okay, Louise, you want to come in on that?
Through yourself, convener. The mobile unit originally, we've not had the time frame in the sense that the mobile unit has been told it would stay with us until. Originally, it would stay with us until June, and then it would stay with us until the end of June. There was you'll recall there was a request from members for it to move into different areas. It was at the waterfront originally, then it went up to the church, the chapel, and then of course there was a notice that the chapel could open again, and they needed their space back, in particular a car park, and we moved it to Port Glasgow because it was opportunistic. We had moved our testing centre. My understanding is that it'll be with us until the end of July, and at this stage we have no intention of moving it anywhere else because it's well situated and we've got a lot of information in relation to Port Glasgow.
Okay, any other questions in relation to testing? I don't see any. Okay, so moving on to section 8, workforce issues. Graham, you want to come in on 8.7?
Thanks very much, convener. Just a point to note, I'm referring to an answer that Stephen McNabb's given, sorry. And it just means that the way that questions are put in advance and officers' response, which was Aubrey's request, which is fantastic, but it means that I would only refer to an answer that other members haven't seen. So if ever we were to continue this style, it may be interesting for officers. I don't know, do you share it with all members? I'll leave that for another day. I just know that other boards share all questions and all answers with all members to ensure openness and transparency. But my question to Stephen, thanks very much for the detail on your response at 8.7. Over £200 spent on equipment, potentially moved to people's homes. And although we don't know how many, it could be up to 400 people. And obviously this gives us the figure of 82,492. My question, is there no way that we're going to duplicate equipment here? For every member of staff who sat in the municipal buildings or somewhere, they had keyboard, they had a monitor, they even had a mouse and a chair. But hopefully a real mouse, not a real mouse, but obviously a digital mouse. And a chair. So we're going to buy £80,000 worth of brand new equipment. Are we leaving £80,000 worth of equipment stocked in our current premises? Why can't we move it if 50% of these staff are now going to be permanently working from home? Would it not just be most cost effective for the taxpayer to actually move the equipment to their home office?
Stephen?
Through you, convener. Yeah, thanks, Councillor Brooks. Yeah, this is very much an estimate in terms of what the costs it may be in terms of home working. You're absolutely right. It depends in terms of what the working pattern is going to be of the individual employee. It may well be that managers making an assessment of what is the most effective way of working, that an employee continues to be perhaps half in the office and half at home. And in that kind of scenario, well, we really do have to have two safe working environments for that individual. And that may well mean having two sets of equipment in terms of chairs, tables, monitors, etc. But there's obviously a degree of flexibility around that as well. It may well be that we have people, perhaps 75% in the office, whereby we need to focus on the office environment in terms of making sure that that's safe and the DSE assessments are carried out, and vice versa. You know, people are more at home, then there needs to be the equipment secured at home and a risk assessment undertaken. So as we've had a discussion at the corporate management team, we know the different scenarios and the potential costs of the different scenarios, but you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously there's ones that are more cost efficient than others, and we need to weigh up the benefits of having individuals working at home against what the costs would be. So I think we're in the process of doing an assessment of the current working arrangements and the lessons learned over the last three months to ascertain what future working patterns will look like in terms of their effectiveness. So we're doing that exercise at the moment. We've got about 800 staff that are working from home in some kind of capacity at the moment. We've made a reasonable assessment, you know, based on that and our initial thinking behind what might be appropriate going forward. And that's where we've come up with the figure of £80,000, which is basically based on half the costs of setting up a home worker for 400 of our staff. Normally you would be looking to pay, it could be up to between £400 and £500 to set up a permanent home worker at home with all the necessary equipment and undertake the necessary assessments. So we have obviously made an appropriate adjustment that we think is reasonable based on what we know at the moment, but we're doing a further, more detailed analysis with that through our managers across the council.
That's helpful. Thanks very much, Convener. Just as you said, Stephen, I was hoping we remain vigilant to the public pound.
Stephen, just to clarify, there is no decision being taken that circa 400 employees will permanently work from home. Right, and employers can't take those decisions without consultation with employees, trade unions, etc. So we're in a sense, we're foreseeing at this point in time that this emergency situation is going to be with us for some time, and that there are benefits in terms of reducing the risk of the virus spreading for people who can work at home to continue to work home for the foreseeable future. But there's no any permanent decision taken about permanent home working yet. Can you clarify that?
Yes, thank you, Convener, through you. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, any permanent arrangements would be undertaken in consultation with employees and the trade unions. And you're absolutely right, this is probably going on longer than initially anticipated. We put temporary arrangements in place for the first few weeks to cover people's health and safety when they're working at home, but we're now getting into that extended period where we really do need to think about supplying appropriate equipment for the well-being of the employee.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, right, moving on, we've got the appendices to the report. So just looking at the log, number 61, 62, 63 and 64. Ronnie, you want to come in 63?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I guess we all want to encourage al fresco drinking in the cafe culture services type idea. And obviously with my licensing board hat on, I'm kind of aware of the fair number of requests that certainly have come through me that I have diverted to our officers. I do know that there are still some tweaks that we have to make to licensing regulations, and we're working through those. I don't think there's any showstoppers there. But my question is it possible to have some kind of report to us? If it has to be in private, then so be it, but a report to us actually outlining the number of requests we've had in Inverclyde to adopt the cafe culture type services right across all of Inverclyde, because I only know of the ones in my locality and a couple of others. But it would be interesting to basically know the number of people who are really interested in doing this. And I guess that kind of ties in a wee bit with the Safer Streets initiative too. So I'd appreciate if Scott or someone could take that on board.
Okay, Scott, would you be able to share some information with members via email?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we can advise of the number of formal applications to us. It would also make the plea to encourage particularly cafes to engage with us, because for a cafe that doesn't need a license, we can issue a consent almost immediately, and they could be trading from the 6th of July on street. But we have been a little disappointed that not more cafes have come forward at this stage.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Okay, so can we turn to the recommendations in the report? My intention would be to go through them one by one, and Gerard will be on hand to keep me right. So recommendations in section 3.1 is for noting. We're happy to note. Yep. 3.2 for noting. We're happy to note. Yeah. 3.3 is about delegated authority. We're happy to agree to that. Yeah. 3.4 is about continuing with the parking suspensions to 11th of August. We're happy to agree to that. Okay. 3.5 is noting. 3.6 is noting. Okay. 3.7 indicated there that he would prefer to have one more meeting diaried between now and the 11th of August. I think there was indications from Elizabeth that she'd be content with that. I'm reasonably content with that. So can you leave it to ourselves and the officers to try and diary a meeting towards maybe the end of July?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
Right, that takes us on to 3.8. We're happy with that. Okay, take it. Right, 3.9, a new point 39, which comes from the addendum report, is with respect to the reopening of shops. So the recommendation from officers is recommended that the committee note the action of officers to support non-essential. Graham has indicated that he's got an amendment to that. Graham, do you want to put forward the amendment?
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, to ensure that, obviously, I don't have the wording and it's hard to email Jerry across, but to ensure that officers can fulfil 2.6, would ask that the cones are removed from the Inverclyde town centres, and that where trading restrictions are required, that the cones are replaced to allow social distancing.
Right, so essentially...
To reverse, it's AB.
So essentially, all of the cones that are in place at the moment, you want them replaced?
Removed.
Sorry, removed. And basically, if if officers feel that they need to be put back in, they can be put back in. Okay.
Yeah, and obviously from a physical point of view, they could do that in their head. They wouldn't have to physically move the cone, physically put them back. But the principle would be the cones aren't there until they're required.
Right, I know, but what I'm saying is there are cones there already, right? So if I take the example of Kilmacole, right, there are cones on St James's Terrace, well, 3/4 of St James's Terrace, okay? There are a number of cafes in there, at least 2 that have indicated they would like potentially from next Monday to have cone off areas where they can, which the assistant have on street tables, right? You want those removed at this point in time and potentially put in place if that demand falls through. And that would be similar in Port Glasgow and Greenock and Guro. So you want every cone removed, right? And
the idea you bring, obviously, the example you bring, I'm not familiar with. Obviously, I'm not in Kilmacole as regularly as you are, sir. But obviously, the officers would not remove those cones because under 2.6, they would determine that it is required to allow the cafe to trade on the 6th of July.
Right, okay. I'm struggling a wee bit to understand how it's different from what's in the report, but Gerard, you were looking to come in, I think, to clarify something?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I was wondering if Councillor Brooks would accept this, because I do think it's what Councillor Brooks was referring to originally in terms of his views on this. May I put it that the amendment be that the TTRO closure of car parking spaces be only used where officers determine there's no detriment to trading, and restrictions will only be applied if necessary to facilitate social distancing. That would be a more general instruction to officers that officers could deal with on the understanding of what your motion really means, i.e. the removal of cones.
Yeah.
That would be the way that I would phrase it, if you would be happy, Councillor Brooks.
Could you read it for a second time, please, Jerry?
Yes, of course. That TTRO closures of car parking spaces be only used where officers determine there is no detriment to trading, and restrictions will only be applied if necessary to facilitate social distancing. I could also add, Councillor Brooks, if you were concerned, that TTRO closures be used for the promotion of outdoor cafe culture. That is something that you said earlier on, but that would be an addition to what I've proposed to you.
Yeah, I'm happy with that wording, Convener.
Okay, thanks for that. Ronnie, I think, indicated you want to come in, and then Chris. Ronnie?
No, I don't think so. I'm
No.
okay.
Okay, right. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a wee bit confused. I mean, that's starting to sound a wee bit like me to Tony Blair's 6 tests for Britain joining the EU. But Jerry was saying there that it sounds so complicated as to, I don't know if that means we're removing cones or we're not removing cones. So if what Graham's proposing is approved, are we going to take all the cones that are still in Kempoke Street away, and all the cones that I've still got pictures of people sending me on Westbrook Hall Street, and also all the cones that are still on Princess Street in Port Glasgow? Are they all going to be taken away then?
I don't think that's what the proposal is. No, if you look to answer for me, but Graham, I don't know if you want to come back in that.
Well, it's up to the officer. It would be up to the officer to determine that the cones are there in X location to ensure that social distancing is maintained, or to ensure that a cafe culture, for want of a better phrase, is provided to the cafes applied. If they can't determine those 2 points, then yes, the cones would be removed.
Okay.
So I don't actually think that what you're proposing actually means anything, because I'm looking at pictures somebody sent me right now of Westbrook Hall Street. So you've got the entire north, east, southwest. You get the entire south side is coned off. So officers would confirm that's a current picture. The entire south side of all the parts coned off. So you could easily argue that, well, if someone's on the extremis of the pavement and someone's walking towards them, well, you can't maintain the 2 metres there. So you wouldn't remove those cones. But I think we need to just stop thinking that people in Inverclyde aren't capable of exercising common sense. I mean, when cars are parked, I mean, when someone in a wheelchair or a pram come towards you now, well, not now with this situation, you just step into the gap in between cars. That's what happens. So I really don't see the need for what I'm looking at, these pictures where you've got the entire side of the street coned off. And what Graham's proposing, I don't actually see how that's going to engineer officers going and picking these cones up, because what you're saying is that, well, of the 2 metre distance rule, they could easily just look at that and go, yeah, well, you need that for 2 metre. I don't think you do need that for 2 metre distance. As I say, people a street which has been open for 3 months, went to Tesco's and listens and for months. There's been queues outside the co-op on Eldon Street and every co-op across Inverclyde, and people have been mad. So did officers just realise that there was an issue with the 2 metres that hadn't been there for the last 3 months?
Chris, with all due respect, we're getting danger of rehearsing a debate, a discussion we had earlier on, which took half an hour, right? And I don't want to have another half an hour, right? So there is a recommendation from officers, right, which is in the addendum report, and there is a motion, an amendment now from Chris, sorry, from Graham, right? Okay. So I think we're giving this a good airing. Okay.
Yeah, so can Mr. Mullen just clarify then, what is the difference between the recommendation and the amendment in terms of what the application will mean?
Yeah.
Convener, thank you. The reason that I am attempting to suggest the wording to Councillor Brooks for his amendment is this, that the Council, as ever, indeed, as we started this meeting, has been very diligent in following the national guidance where that's available. Scott explained the situation about the guidance. The reason that I'm saying this is that it is officers' responsibility, members' responsibility to promote public safety. To have a motion, as originally proposed by Councillor Brooks, for the removal of cones appears to me, convener, to be involving members in a direct operational type of decision and instruction to officers to remove cones from all locations. I think, given the fact that this debate is happening and that officers are clearly hearing what members are saying themselves and what members are saying on behalf of constituents and traders, it's very clear that you want a complete review and a reappraisal of what has been undertaken. The normal form for members to instruct that reappraisal is not to say, go and remove all cones, because that might lead to unforeseen consequences. It's not for me to advise the council on that. That's a matter for Scott, matter for Gail. But I would be saying that the normal proposal, which Councillor Brooks has accepted, is that there is a, in principle, a clear instruction that officers will only use the car parking spaces, i.e. cone them off, where there's no detriment to traders, and the restrictions will only be applied if it's necessary to achieve social distancing. And we're also promoting cafe culture. I think that they are very clear parameters, convener, but it is of course a matter for Councillor Brooks, as the mover of the amendment, to be satisfied or not with that as a proposal.
Okay, so there is a recommendation in the report and there is an amendment from Councillor Brooks. Okay, are there any other further amendments?
Stephen, I had a question, if that's okay, sorry.
Sure.
guess I just really want to make sure that whatever we vote on, or whatever I personally vote on today, indicates clearly that I think some of the codes that are currently in place shouldn't be there, but they've been put there by our officers who think that they should. And that's, I guess, the crux of it. Some of them I don't think should be there based on what's happened over the last couple of days. And I need to make sure that what I am able to vote on indicates that the number of cones that are there are excessive at the minute. And I just want to kind of bottom that out finally before I actually vote on anything.
Well, as it stands at this point in time, Elizabeth, as I say, there's a recommendation in the report that nobody's yet moved, and there is also an amendment, right? Gerard, can you assist Elizabeth?
Convener, Councillor Robertson has very clearly assisted me, at least, in reinforcing my argument that if there is to be specific removal of cones in certain locations, knowing that members and knowing that officers have clearly wished to reappraise what's been undertaken here, there might be unforeseen circumstances, consequences at the removal of cones from the locations that are in Councillor Robertson's mind, and they are of an operational nature. If they're going to be challenged, then the officers, Gail, Scott, will be able to engage on that specific site. With the overall proposal, which after all has been aired just now, that there will be no restrictions except where it's necessary to facilitate social distancing. So that's the test that officers would have to go back to Councillor Robertson on to justify there. In that particular circumstance, that's why cones have to remain, or that's why cones have to go. But in this case, that's why the cones would have to remain. I think the matter is covered by Councillor Brooks' proposal, but of course it's for Councillor Brooks to determine that.
Okay, right, so does anybody want to move the recommendation in the report?
Just a bit of clarity, Stephen. See what officers have currently got the delegated authority to do then, Mr. Malone. Should we be expecting to see vast areas of streets outside schools coned off then? Because obviously this is pertinent to the fact that we might not be having a meeting in July, which we're now going to have. The leader's going to agree with officers. Because are we going to expect that then in the first 2 weeks in August? We're going to see all these streets coned off, because they're not really any different from shops, are they? And I don't feel we're going to get ourselves into a definitive position on this.
Convener, I think the issues about the schools are of course an entirely separate matter to the actual trading within Green Town centres or the promotion of cafe culture. The access to schools is very much one of ensuring that the council provides safe access to all of our educational establishments. I think that's different to the trading issue.
Okay, right. We're really making hard work of this, to be perfectly honest. Councillor Clockerty wants to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I mean, I think our officers have already shown good common sense with regard to this, and I think they'll continue to do so. I would move the recommendation.
Okay, right. Does anybody else want to move anything else? Chris, did you want to come in?
I was just, well, if people make political points during moving things, it's then unfair, because they sometimes should be responded to. But if you think there's a common sense approach being displayed, you've obviously not went for a walk down West Hall Street today and looked at the state it's in. And if you think that's a common sense approach, then perhaps you need to consider your position.
Can I get back in there? Because I think that was totally uncalled for. Absolutely totally uncalled for, Chris. Really uncalled for. It's a couple of times I've made snidey comments, and I think that was really uncalled for. What I'm actually saying here is officers have clearly listened to the Scottish Government proposals. They've moved in order to try and ensure that social distances are put in place. They've listened to elected members' concerns. They've moved on elected members' concerns. They'll continue to do that. So therefore, I've moved that we went to the recommendation. I don't see anything political in what I said, and I think your remarks were just really quite snidey, actually.
Okay, right. So we have a motion, which Gerard, and an amendment. Gerard, you can decide what's the motion and the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. Just for clarity, given that the recommendation is written there in front of members, could we please, with your agreement, make the motion Councillor Clockerty's motion in terms of the recommendation that is written. In which case, if that is accepted, the amendment is proposed by Councillor Brooks. I would phrase that on the basis of TTRO closures of car parking spaces be only used where officers determine there's no detriment to trading, and restrictions will only be applied if necessary to facilitate social distancing. TTRO closures be used where necessary for the promotion of outdoor cafe culture. That would be the amendment if Councillor Brooks is satisfied with that.
Satisfied.
Thank you for that. It will be a roll call vote. I will ask for votes firstly on the amendment. That is Councillor Brooks' amendment, TTRO's restrictions applied. Councillor Fogarty's is the motion, and the motion is as written within the papers, the report. Councillor Alfeld, motion or amendment?
Amendment.
Councillor Brooks, amendment.
Amendment.
Thank you. Councillor Clougherty, the motion.
Motion.
Thank you. Councillor McCabe.
Amendment.
Councillor McElhenney.
Amendment.
And Councillor Robertson.
Amendment.
Convener, I declare the amendment carried by 1, 2, 3, 5 votes, and the motion won. The amendment is carried.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, can we now, there was also one further recommendation that I made in the course of the meeting that we agreed. Gerard, do you want to, just for the completeness, add that to the recommendations?
Yes, please, Convener. I would also, Convener, with your agreement, add a further recommendation, and it's in relation to paragraph 5.21, the newly self-employed, and that is that the leader of the council writes to the Scottish Government to make representations on gaps. I would propose that to you, Convener, as being recommendation 310. In terms of recommendation 311, as per the discussions at the meeting, that in terms of paragraph 6, section 6, the Chief Executive write to the Cabinet Secretary on the collaborative Public Health Scotland and University of Glasgow study to ask for a focus on issues affecting Inverclyde, and if additional resources are required, to timely report on this for the Council to provide funding to make this possible. I have no other recommendations, Convener.
Okay, are we agreed?
Agreed.
On those? Okay, we got there eventually. It's only 4:30, and we've done one item. Okay, that takes us on to item 3, which is the financial update, financial strategy, and unaudited accounts. Alan.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, everyone. This report's rolling up 3 specific issues, which would normally come separately. Appendix 1 of the report outlines the latest position in respect of the governmental funding that's come to the council or is being administered by the council, and I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding that. Appendix 2 gives the initial proposals for the use of the second wave of food, the food fund. We still haven't had notification of our actual share. I'm estimating it's going to be around about £500,000, and that's included in Appendix 2. It's just to allow officers to continue with the delivery of these services over the summer period, with a commitment that an update will be given to the August P&R. In Appendix 3 is the financial strategy, which has obviously been prepared at a time of COVID, and I've tried as best as possible to update the economic situation in section 4 of the report, the impact on the Scottish Government and the impact on the council. I would highlight that the 2021-23 funding gap remains at about £11 million, but that assumes the use of a £3 million smoothing reserve that members agreed as part of last year's budget. Clearly, if as part of the reserves to extra costs associated with use that, then the funding gap will grow commensurately. And Appendix 4 is the annual accounts summary, And I'm aware that all members got sent an electronic copy of the annual accounts, and the unaudited annual accounts are also on the website with the papers. I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding that, but the main purpose is today is the statutory deadline for getting the accounts in. And whilst councils have been given time to get the accounts in, I think it was a matter of professional pride from our team that they wanted to ensure they could get that in time. And I have to say it's been a tremendous job for them to do this in the circumstances that they're working in. The main matter I would highlight there is that the outturn for last year was £1.5 million better than it was projected at the budget time, and there's some narrative in Appendix 4 regarding that. I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding this or any other parts of the report.
Okay, thanks for that, Alan. And I think before I bring members in, I think it's important that we do commend officers for being able to produce the draft accounts within the original timescale and bring them to us before the end of June. That's certainly exceptional in the current environment. So if you could pass on our thanks and congratulations, Alan, to your team. Okay, I've got an indication from Councillor Alfield he wishes to come in.
Thanks, Stephen, and obviously congratulations to Alan and the team for an absolutely outstanding effort with the account. Alan, I've got one or two questions here from the appendix. The first one I have is 2C. Now that one is further expansion, bringing charities business that do not pay rates directly. We understood that some of the bowling clubs were asked to resubmit applications due to changes in Scottish Government deadlines. Basically, clubs who had received no financial assistance since it started. And the first question, I guess, is, have we any decisions on that? That's the first question. The second one is probably not for you, Alan. It's about the food fund, I think. Well, it's about the food fund, and it's number 8 that I have here. And it's a question about extending the PH1 projects until schools return for free school meals at the end of September for other projects. Members have agreed to continue free school meal payments over the summer. Basically, the question is proposals for the non-free school meals being developed. Would the third sector assist in any of that? That kind of process? And the last one is the digital exclusion. It's number 11. And would the demand be the exact same if the children do go back in August? That's it, Stephen.
Okay, Alan, do you want to come in, and if you want to pass any of the questions over to colleagues?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the questions, Councillor Arfield. I can appreciate the frustration that is amongst a number of ratepayers and non-rate payers with the constantly shifting sands of the scheme. I think everyone's been acting with the best of intentions, but I understand it has been frustrating. If applications have been received, they will obviously be assessed on the basis of the latest guidance we've got. I'm not in a position to say whether any specific applications have been received or approved, etc. I do have a meeting in a couple of days' time to go through some of the more complex cases with my team. But at least there's the opportunity now for some organisations who were originally told they couldn't apply to now put in for the business grants. And we'll progress those through the process in the next couple of weeks. As regards the food fund is concerned, if I can maybe start off on that, maybe pass over to Ruth. Say we're waiting for notification. The purpose at this point in time is to get agreement to continue a couple of the projects that we've got over the summer holidays. My understanding is that the other projects that we've already given funding to through the first wave of the food fund are going to continue. That's Belleville and it's the I-58 food bank. They don't need any further funding at this point in time. There will be other things that maybe officers will develop. They will be brought back. The plan was to the August Policy and Resources Committee, but now we have a decision for maybe an interim P&R exec subcommittee. We can maybe have a think about bringing information back to that. And the digital inclusion, I'll pass over to Ruth to answer that because that's more an educational issue than an ICT issue.
Thanks, Alan.
Sorry, Councillor Arfold, I missed your question about the digital inclusion. I thought it was sort of third sector for free school meals.
No, it's about digital exclusion, Ruth. Alan's touched on the school meals one. It was basically just to ask the question is, basically, would all of that funding be necessary if all the children go back to school in August?
Okay, so we simply don't know what the mixture of blended learning will look like. But we are hoping to, as we go into recovery, to learn from the good practice that we've taken forward already. And I think there is an option for blended learning, even if pupils are completely in school 100% of the time. And what we would see, and what we see other authorities looking at, is a model where you have an entitlement for ICT as we move forward. So yes, I think in what we're proposing, looking at particularly around preschool meals, and also looking at the senior phase who are doing their qualifications, yes, I would anticipate that even when we're in a post-COVID environment, that what we take forward from the blended learning will help education in the Clyde.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any other questions at this point. Okay, so are we happy to agree the recommendations? Yeah, so we discussed the finance update, financial strategy and unaudited accounts in circa 10 minutes, and it took us about probably about 50 minutes to discuss parking in the town. Okay. Right, moving on to item 4, COVID mortality report, June 2020. Louise.
Through yourself, I'd like to members will recall that unfortunately we had our first death in relation to Inverclyde in the 23rd of March. Then at that point we were concerned, and we had started to move into, and we were seeing a high rate in relation to the hospital. I was getting daily reports. Alan and myself were tracking some of the deaths through the registrations, and we seen a peak in the 6th of April. The members of this committee obviously asked us to look at and talk to public health so we could understand whether this variation was significant. At that point, we were 3 times the national average. Alan Puckrin and myself, as the director, had a conversation and made an approach to the Health Board and Public Health. And John O'Dowd and Paul Burton went away to look to see whether the information was significant and whether it was worth having a further look at. They did come back and say that it was significant and that they would go and analyse it. The emerging picture was that at that point, we knew across the totality of the system that deprivation was playing a significant factor in relation to COVID, as was ethnicity and the age profile. And Dr. O'Dowd, who was a public health consultant at the time and is now the clinical director in Glasgow, went away and looked at all the age profile. He also looked at social and economic deprivation and at that profile. And then he tried to standardise some of the data. Elected members will have had the opportunity on the 18th of June for an all-members briefing, and they also presented the report to the IGB on the 23rd. We also asked them, as you would expect, we were keen to know that it wasn't the quality of the services, was it because we had withdrawn something? And so he went and he analysed some of this information. We also wanted to know in relation to care homes and whether the decision in relation to care homes had impacted in relation to the deaths. What he was able to come back and tell us is that he could see there was no significant difference in relation to us to others in relation to care homes. In fact, we're slightly below the national average. And his summary was that we had an early pandemic in Inverclyde before we went into lockdown. It was spreading through our community, and at that time there was not enough trace and contact for him to be able to tell us where that had come from. Just to pick up your point, convener, I was in the meeting with the Chief Executive and the Cabinet Secretary, and the Chief Executive did press the Cabinet Secretary quite hard about trying to help us understand in Inverclyde why we had an outbreak early. And really just trying to reiterate by understanding why, hoping it might help us in the future, should we have a second peak, that we were able to learn from those lessons. Happy, to the best of my ability, to take any questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Louise. I suppose I did make some comment in this report earlier on. This is not the report I was looking for, and it was me, I think, that asked for the report, not the agreement of the committee in the first place. I mean, essentially, from my perspective, this report seeks to compare us to Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and through statistical analysis, suggests that we're in the same sort of ballpark as Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And it's written by Greater Glasgow and Clyde. It doesn't actually answer the question why we, as part of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, are so ahead of the rest of Scotland in terms of death rates, with the council areas that make up Greater Glasgow and Clyde, I think, being 6 of the top 8 in the country. I think it's a fairly superficial report, fairly high level, and as I say, essentially it doesn't explain to me how COVID-19 came to Inverclyde, how it was transmitted in Inverclyde, and it doesn't really come up with any sort of lessons that we need to learn for the future. I think the look at basically the quality of healthcare is very cursory as well, and I think the focus on care homes is very cursory as well. And I mean, I think certainly the care homes, I'd expect that to be a significant issue in any future public inquiry into this, but we can't wait till a public inquiry to start to get some of the answers. And I think that's why it's important that we get a separate report through Public Health Scotland, working with the University of Glasgow, to bring independence to the report, to try and answer the questions that remain unanswered. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, convener. You'll be unsurprised. I think that there has been no politics throughout this whole crisis, and very much I have been in agreement with you in most of the things you've said, and I think that there's been times, obviously, when you've also been in agreement with me. I think that of the report, and I've never seen, I just should say that I thank Louise Long for it. Obviously, there's been a lot of engagement, I think, with a lot of members behind the scenes on answering various questions and seeking further clarity. But I've never seen a commissioned report that basically comes to the conclusion that something happened through chance, but doesn't assume or expect that people are going to say, well, okay, how did the chance happen? Because it wasn't just chance that a pandemic that started in a province in China managed to get its way into Europe, and then it got its way from Europe into the UK, into Scotland. And as the conveners pointed out, of all the places in Scotland that decided that the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board would be the area that was worst hit, and of all the places in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, it was Inverclyde that it decided to come to first. I think that people in Inverclyde deserve to know what was the reason behind that. And obviously some of the conversations we've had, Louise, have been about testing. And this report to me highlights an absolutely fundamental failure in a response to this virus, which has sadly caused people's lives in Inverclyde. Because one of the questions I'd put to you was, well, if we're saying it was chance, well, how does that then equate to contact tracing? Because in March, the World Health Organization were ramming home the message of test, test, test. And it was through the actions of this committee and the Chief Executive and yourself as our senior officer, from lobbying very, very hardly on a cross-party, no political party at all front, to demand more testing came to Inverclyde, and it finally did come to Inverclyde. But on the issue of contact tracing, if contact tracing had been carried out, the whole point of contact tracing is that when someone presents himself with the symptoms, they test positive, you then trace their contacts, and then you know who they've been in contact with. So the theory behind contact tracing means that, well, you should be able to follow that all the way to, well, where did the virus start coming into Inverclyde each time you push those contacts. And one of my colleagues was talking to me as well that the scientific strides have now been able to hone in on specific strands of the virus. So when the positive tests have been made on specific strands, those strands can be traced back. So, for example, the Nike incident in Edinburgh, the specific strand there was traced to a specific import into the country. That was thankfully a strand of the virus that died on a pretty small scale. But if this report was going to say it was chance, surely one of the key recommendations that this report should be finding was that going forward, we can't ever have a situation that we don't have a sufficient test capacity. Because if the sufficient test capacity remained and we had stayed in the suppression stage and continued to aggressively test anyone that had the symptoms, then we would have found these contact traces and we'd have known how this virus came into Inverclyde. And the answers back to some of the issues was that, well, capacity wasn't there. Well, that's a fail. That's a failure of the capacity wasn't there, not of anyone in this meeting. I'm just saying that's manifestly a failure. And I'm also saying that, well, actually, we weren't asking people to present unless they were working in health and social care, or whether it was in hospital they were tested. People within the community weren't being tested. That's a failure in policy. So going forward, if we're talking about, well, there could be, I mean, we're already seeing in the news, people are predicting future pandemics, there could be second waves. We need to make sure that we grasp where the policy failures have been here. And it's an absolute policy failure that contact trace and test trace and isolate was abandoned. Because if it hadn't been abandoned, we would have vigorously pursued people that had symptoms. We would have tested them. We would have traced their contacts, and they would have went into isolation. And I think that would have made a massive difference to people in Inverclyde. But picking up on the point that the convener made, and I'm very supportive of it, I think that if there was a properly independent commission piece of work that was sufficiently resourced, then that work can start happening now. That we go and find out, well, who died, who did the contact, and those contacts can be traced back to a point that this virus came into Inverclyde. And I think that's key, that we need to find that out, because I just don't accept that it was chance that, as I said, this virus started in Wuhan, it made its way into the UK, it then made its way into Scotland, and it made its way into Inverclyde, because at each of those supposed junctions, there could be a policy answer of how you could have stopped that from happening. You know what I mean? You could have said, well, if we had stopped the flights coming into Heathrow directly from Wuhan, or perhaps then it was the flights from Heathrow to Glasgow or Edinburgh, and then, well, how did these people that seemed to be on these flights, why were they then coming back to Inverclyde? I'd quite like to get to the bottom of that, because I want to make sure that going forward, and I'm sure everybody does, if there's ever a second wave or another pandemic, we're in a position that we have robust policy positions to make sure that we test people, we isolate people, we trace our contacts, make sure we stop the spread of the virus. Whereas this report's basically saying that, well, we just never really did enough quickly enough in Inverclyde, and we were just unlucky that it came to Inverclyde before the rest of the country went into lockdown. And because we went in lockdown, it just ran through our whole community. And I just think that the people that have died because of that deserve to know the answers, as the convener said, as to how it came to Inverclyde. And I think we owe is a testament to them to make sure we have a robust policy in place going forward, that we don't have another pandemic in the future, that we're just unlucky that it decides to come here. And while people are getting infected by this deadly contagion and starting to die, we're waiting on some national decision to say, well, we should go into a lockdown. I mean, we should also perhaps be pursuing, as we see now, that there's going to be a decision that Leicester's getting put into an extended lockdown on its own. Perhaps that's powers we would want to have going forward, so that we could have took decisions locally when we knew this was happening. And I think, just to address one of the points about the socio-economic relationship to the virus, I just don't see how the evidence and the data can add up that it can just be a chance across the whole UK, not just Scotland. People living in deprivation are 2 times more likely to have died of the coronavirus than people that aren't living in deprivation. I don't see how across the whole UK, the entire population of tens of millions of people, that can just be chance. In every single deprived community, there is a double the chance of dying from the coronavirus. I don't accept that's chance. I think there are clearly underlying generational health inequalities that once the virus does perhaps come to your community early, let's accept that could have happened. The socio-economic factors within Inverclyde and all these deprived communities clearly must have been a factor. They clearly must have been, because you can't. Chance shows that people living in deprivation just happened to be 2 times more likely to die of the coronavirus, just because it just happened that perhaps all these deprived communities were exposed to the virus earlier. I can't accept that. That's why it might be uncomfortable, but when members of our community are dying, I think we need to speak uncomfortable truths. And I think this was a whitewash report, because I think this was a report written by people that had a policy locus in the involvement and control of the virus, to an extent asked to mark their own homework and how they handled the virus. So that's why I think an independently commissioned piece of work would very much be welcome. And I think that the letter that we agreed would be written at the previous item there, I think should be sent with the most robust terms, and we should certainly impress upon the government the timescale that we would hope that piece of work would be carried out. And indeed, I agree that we would be more willing to put up money, but I think the government as well should be challenged to the extent that they would be willing to support that.
Sorry, Councillor. Sorry, Convener, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to Chris, I agree with a lot of what he said, but I don't agree with everything, because I don't think the report was saying that by chance people in poverty with comorbidity, etc., were badly hit by that. I think it was more comparing Clyde to the rest of Greater Glasgow and Clyde than comparing us to anywhere else in Scotland. But I'll bring others in. I think Councillor Clockerty's want to come in, and anybody else before I bring you back in, Louise.
No problem.
No, Stephen, I'm okay. I don't need to come in.
You sure? Okay.
Yep.
Any other member want to come in? No. Okay, Louise.
Through yourself, Convener. Just to reiterate the point that you've just made, I mean, I think Dr. O'Dowd's report doesn't say that there's not a link with deprivation in relation to COVID. There's very clear links in relation to deprivation, poverty, COVID. In fact, there was a joint improvement report that came out fairly recently in relation to that, which shows it across the totality of Scotland. What his report does is, when you take the deprivation away, and we also asked them, when you take away the profile, because was it something to do with the older age profile that we had in Inverclyde? And when you take all that away, he comes to a conclusion that, in fact, it was by chance that we were hit early and we were hit hard. I completely agree, and I think the Chief Executive in the conversation with the Cabinet Secretary was very clear that he wanted to understand why. And by understanding why, hopefully help us to learn in relation to the future. And what I would say in relation to the COVID, the report that John's done, is that it did give some reassurance. It gave some reassurance that we don't have the issues that others have, despite having the high numbers of deaths in our community and our care homes. It does give some reassurance that our hospital is not out of sync with any other hospital across the whole of the GGC. But equally, if members want more information, that is completely understandable, and obviously we will go away and try and make sure that happens.
Okay, so in terms of the report, the recommendation is we note the report. Okay, are we content to note the report, given that we obviously have now asked earlier in the meeting for a separate report?
Yeah, just for the purpose of perhaps historic accounting, for want of a better phrase, could we note that we have previously agreed that recommendation, so that this report doesn't show up that all we've done is noted? Because of course we've not just noted it, because as you say rightly, we've agreed to other actions. So could we just note that previous action has already been agreed to? Okay,
Gerard, could you minute accordingly?
Convener, yes, we would note that agreement, but we would cross-refer to the earlier decision explicitly within the minute.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, can we now move on to item 5, COVID-19 Business Support Scheme? Stuart's going to speak to
that. Through you, Convener, the report before you seeks authority for a COVID-19 business support intervention to provide gap funding to businesses who have not been successful in accessing mainstream UK or Scottish Government schemes, such as furlough, because their documentary evidence has prevented access to such schemes. This intervention is not aimed at replacing any existing interventions such as grants. It's designed to complement them, nor, convener, is it designed for sole traders who have claimed universal credit. The report seeks authority to amend the scheme of delegation for officers on a short-term basis and to offer local businesses access to this intervention for loans of up to £30,000, repayable over 2 years at a rate of 2.5%. Whilst this intervention should be cost neutral, it is high risk and could result in budget pressure, so we propose to utilise our former West Scotland loan funds to underwrite the process. Convener, as this is a product under the auspices of the Financial Conduct Authority, we will need the intervention to be administered by a company registered on the Financial Services Register. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Stuart. First question from Ronnie.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Stuart. Stuart, on 4.2 in the report, I wonder if you've got any indication at all of just how many companies could be in this category. That is to say, ones who are unable to access the various schemes that are available currently. Do you have any idea of the number?
Through you, Convener, we only have indications of small numbers at this stage, but you'll recognise that if the subcommittee are minded to support this, then this is something which would go on the website, and it's available for all businesses in Inverclyde who have not been able to access the government schemes.
Okay, thanks, Stuart.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Thanks, Stuart. It's quite a short report, but I think it's got quite a bit of meaty substance in it, so I quite welcome that. I think it's absolutely right that if we can support business that have fell into cracks, then we should do so. So first question would be if you would be able to obviously report back on any positive developments as a result of the policy. And the second question would be, so as you're rightly highlighting that we're now using our local resources to address cracks that governmental schemes are presenting to businesses. Can you perhaps comment on how that relates to our ability to support individual people who fell into those cracks? Obviously, we'd agree that one of the previous items that the leader would write to the government. Are the rules different in what we can offer to individuals in terms of ability to create payments to them where a government scheme puts them into a crack?
Sure.
Through you, Convener. Yeah, happy to report any activity on the scheme through regular updates. This scheme is not, Convener, aimed at those, for example, who have benefited from PAYE and thus making themselves ineligible for example, the newly self-employed hardship fund. This scheme is primarily aimed at the bigger schemes like furlough or anything associated with scale, whereby the documentary evidence which is required for those schemes has not been in a format to allow the applicant to be able to access the scheme. It's not a panacea for all cracks, Councillor McElhenney. It's only a panacea for large-scale interventions whereby local business finds itself in extreme difficulty because it can't access the furlough scheme because, for example, its accounts aren't up to date or its accounts weren't registered at the appropriate time.
Okay, just to clarify, in terms of that, Stuart, there are other business supports available as well?
Absolutely, Convener.
Okay. Graham, I think your question's been answered, is that right?
Yes, Rory asked the same question, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so could we agree the recommendation? Yeah. Okay, moving on to item 6, freedom of information annual report. Carol's going to speak to that.
Thank you, Convener. So the report's brought forward today to give an annual update on the freedom of information requests received in the year 2019, which covers 1st of January to the 31st of December 2019 inclusive. The report outlines a number of requests received over that period, which is highlighted in section 5.1. I don't propose to go through all of the individual numbers, so I'll just call out some of the main highlights for updating purposes in light of time. 5.3 covers some of the comparison from 2018's performance. So there's a marginal decrease in the number of volumes received in the period when comparing 2018 to 2019. There's a 50% reduction in environmental information requests and a 60% increase in subject access requests, which is largely attributable to the change in legislation when the new GDPR legislation came into force on the 25th of May 2018. In terms of requests that were responded to on time, we had 1,144 requests responded to on time, 119 requests which were responded to out with timescales, and it should be noted that there is a decrease of 60% in those responded to late, which is largely attributable to the oversight and focus that services have placed within the responses being provided to requesters. In terms of carried forward requests, there's 25 requests that were withdrawn or carried forward, and again it reflects a 54% reduction in the returns coming through that particular criteria. Again, that's action attributable to services for increased focus in that area. In light of reviews that we've received in 2019, there was 9 requests under the FOISA regime for a review to be undertaken and 3 under the environmental information requests. Laterally, there was 2 requests which were referred to the Information Commissioner for a decision, one of which was upheld and agreed with the Council's decision on appeal, and the other case was later withdrawn by the applicant upon receipt of further information. The last point for noting is 6.1, which outlines the time and estimated costs associated with responding to FOIs. This, when comparing to the previous recorded costs and time, reflects an improvement in the accuracy that was noted within the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have today.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Question from Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just starting for the financial costs, I mean, obviously you've got potentially 1 or 2 jobs worth of costs there. So just our group had discussed, could we perhaps reduce the amount of requests that come in by better advertising the responses to requests and basically categorising them and putting them into topics so that it would stop multiple repeat requests for the same information from different individuals. And in terms of another question, when someone submits a freedom of information request or a environmental information request or a subject access request, whatever, perhaps not subject access request because obviously they're separate, but do you categorise them in terms of where they come from, i.e. do they come from a political party, do they come from a pressure group, etc.? And if you do that, would it be possible to actually show that so that members could maybe have a better understanding of, out of the, say, 1,144 freedom of information requests, was that 1,144 individuals in Inverclyde community that wanted information? Was it only 10 individuals in Inverclyde, but 700 of them were from a trade union or a political party, etc.? So we could have a better understanding of who's kind of requesting information in vast quantities, which obviously then does impact on that first point about the financial implication.
Yep. Okay, happy to.
Yep.
Yep, happy to answer that question. I'll take the first one first. So proactive disclosure log is something that would be welcomed and it would assist with reduction in costs. There is a project which is being delayed for a number of reasons, and laterally because of the impact that COVID has had, which is looking at improvements and systems that could be brought in place, which would include proactive disclosure of responses that we've previously provided. So that's an avenue that is being explored. The revised date for that project is December 2020. So it's an area that I'll pick up directly with my line manager in terms of how we lead and move that forward. The other aspect of that is proactively publishing data onto our websites to enable requesters to self-service, and that proves particularly useful in terms of reducing the amount of time that may be involved in responding to a particular request. So they're both valid points in areas that are being looked at presently. The second question in terms of categorisation of requests, I know that this is something that has been done periodically over the time that we've done reporting on FOI requests. Presently, we don't have a categorisation that looks specifically at who's requesting it. However, it could be interfaced at the point of inception of the request coming in. There is a large spread of requests that come from individuals. You do get media outlets, parliamentary assistants looking for requests, but presently we don't have a reporting in place that would enable us to do that efficiently. But if it was a requirement, it could be built into the front-facing template that we use to capture that information.
Yeah, can I just come back in? Just one minor point there, Convener.
Of course you can.
Yeah, I appreciate that last point. That was one of the groups I omitted, but I think that's very good to highlight that, because I think sometimes that highlights a breakdown in the relationship between spheres of government, where parliamentary assistants, whether it's for list MSPs or whatever, feel they need to submit a freedom of information request to get information out of the council. I would hope that they themselves could be encouraged into a more positive relationship, that they feel that they can actually just have a dialogue with the council or elected members to get information, because really, I'm sure there's not any information that should be hidden, with the exception of maybe commercially sensitive stuff or meetings that happen in private for similar reasons. So I think that it just does, when you look at it in paper, it is quite stark that you've got pushing 2,000 hours of officer resources are spent on things that perhaps there isn't a common good aspect of the reason behind the request. I mean, I think it's absolutely right that media outlets, etc., do get to scrutinise and hold institutions to account, but I think that perhaps if I could see on a list of where all these requests are coming from, there might be some groups that, such as parliamentarians or parliamentary assistants or third-party pressure groups that have, well, it had to be advertised. Well, if it was publicly available that they were the reason that the council had to spend £30,000 because they were constantly asking for different bits of information, which meant it wasn't actually quite malicious because they weren't constantly asking for the same information. Perhaps maybe they would themselves be a wee bit more positive in just engaging with the council through normal measures, because I just don't think it's ideal that people actually ever need to resort to putting in a freedom of information request to get information. I think every time a FOI is submitted, there is a wee bit of a breakdown there.
Yeah, but some people do submit FOIs for political reasons, the Taxpayers Alliance being one example of that. I mean, I think it would be helpful, Carol, if, because we have seen this information before, as you said, if the previous report that included that breakdown of the sources of the inquiries was circulated to members out with the meeting, and if you did look at the sort of template going forward to see if it can be captured in, as you say, a more efficient way rather than people trawling through backdated requests to come up with information.
Yeah, certainly it could be looked at being built into the current model and how we capture that at the outset, which would mean it would be fairly easy to produce that for reporting purposes and to share with elected members, given the interest in that particular topic. And probably just to close off the points, I think really the key actions are around where we can possibly use our website effectively to put as much information on there as possible. We can cut down considerable time that's involved in responding to requests if we just put more information on there. It's a very simple then turnaround of that request, along with a disclosure log and previously responded to requests, which the project will look at.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, no other questions? We agree the recommendation? Okay, that comes to the end of the business. I was going to be saying enjoy your long break between now and the 11th of August, but I won't say that. So we're obviously going to have a meeting towards the end of July, but can I wish all of you some respite in the coming weeks, if you can try and get a wee break or whatever. I don't think too many of us will be flying off to the sun, but I have to express my appreciation. I'm sure it'll be the appreciation of the committee and indeed the entire council for all the work that officers have put in over the last 3 months or so. It's been an extraordinary time in all of our lives, and you have all risen to the challenge, and I'm entirely grateful, and I'm sure the council is, for all your efforts. So thank you. And goodbye.
Thank you.